Well, looks like we have everybody here. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our train trek to Auburn. My name is Gary Wirt. I'm a board member of All Aboard Washington and a resident of Yakima, Washington, which is one of the cities on the proposed Stampede Pass route. Um, this is the fifth in a series of meetings that we originally planned to have live. And of course, the pandemic has stopped all of that. But our purpose has been to increase public awareness of the potential of reestablishing passenger service on the Stampede Pass route, and also to encourage involvement from our local elected officials. So we started off with a meeting in Yakima back in March, and then we had one in Spokane, and over the course of the summer, then we had one for Ellensburg, and then Cle Elum and Pasco. And now this is the final one in this series, which was focused on Auburn. So with that in mind, I would like to introduce former mayor and city councilman of Auburn, Mr. Pete Lewis. Pete has served a number of organizations around King County and Pierce County, and he is now a member of All Aboard Washington. And Pete is going to give us a little history about our railroad in Auburn. Pete, go ahead.
Thank you very much and welcome everyone. I appreciate this opportunity. Auburn has always been a railroad town. Since railroads first came to the Northwest, Auburn has had a station here, and in the midst of that became a railroad town. It was a timber community. It was a farming community. It was a supplier of foodstuffs for what became the cities of Tacoma and Seattle. The rail has always been an important function, and our rail station here, our rail yard, is one of the largest in the Northwest. Our function with the city of Auburn and the railroad has always been a partnership. You can see through our history, from the development of the rail yard, where we had our massive round table, which would accommodate multiple locomotives at the same time, to all the work that has been ongoing ever since. In Auburn's history, recent history, one of the things you might notice is when the Regional Transit Authority first proposed having some type of a commuter rail service, Auburn was on board that as well. The first station was in Auburn. And we have had a commitment to not just commuter rail, but also regional rail for many years, close to a century. We had rail going from west to east. This opportunity, or one of the opportunities that we see, is not just for a commuter rail system locally, but also for a connection point from the city of Auburn, where the Stampede Pass line starts, to go east for Yakima, for Spokane, and parts east of there. It all starts with the willingness for everyone to be on board. And we appreciate the efforts that are made in community, the efforts that are made throughout this railroad town and in this region, so that we can once again travel east on a rail line right here from Auburn. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoy the rest of the meeting as well. Good day.
Thank you, Pete. Another point of significance about Auburn is, I think most of you may be aware that Amtrak provided passenger rail service over Stampede Pass until 1981. And Auburn was particularly important because Amtrak had a bus that ran from Tacoma's Union Station up to Auburn. And it was really quite handy. I mean, you checked your luggage and everything there at Union Station in Tacoma, and then got on the short bus ride and went up to East Auburn and got on the train eastbound there. So Auburn is significant to this route. So moving on now, next is Abe Zumwalt. And Abe is going to talk to us. Abe is a transportation analyst for RL Banks, and he's also a board member of All Aboard Washington. And I think most of you know that the STEER study, or you're familiar with the STEER study that was released in July. It concluded that this service we're talking about is both operationally and technically feasible. However, the report left some unanswered questions, which STEER fully admits that further work is needed to confirm or refine their findings. And Abe has been doing that over the past few months. And so here's Abe to report on how beneficial this line will be. Abe?
Hello, everybody. I just needed to unmute. Sorry about that. So yes, I performed a few months back a very preliminary overview of some extrapolated benefits we could see from a new east-west passenger rail service via Yakima to Spokane. And while there are other things in the STEER study that need elaboration, I have not touched upon, we can talk about those later on in the presentation. So today we're going to talk about the draft benefits of the East-West Spokane service, working from what STEER found in its feasibility study. We're going to look at the benefits of the Cascade service using the same methodology that we're going to look through to the draft benefits of the East-West service. And then we're going to talk a bit about how we might be able to see more of these benefits and how a few targeted investments could see great returns for the state, especially in the recovery curve from the pandemic. So what we contemplate here is STEER talks about 1 to 2 trains a day between Seattle and Spokane via Auburn, Yakima, Tri-Cities. And what they contemplate there is we need about $15 to $30 million, roughly double, for those 1 to 2 trains every year. However, for investing that amount, we see in gains perhaps $33 to $36 million between those 1 to 2 trains. So those trains more than pay for themselves in indirect benefits that the state would see. And that's just from car trips diverted. That isn't counting the additional visitor spending, that isn't counting pollution saved, and that isn't spending money that Washingtonians would no longer have to fork over to the airlines. One of the really interesting things about the STEER study is that they only considered diversion from car trips. So in their minds, at least in the terms of the study, people coming from Spokane, Tri-Cities, Yakima, through Auburn to Seattle would only come from cars. And this is actually interesting for terms of preliminary analysis because this means that we can look at a lot of avoided vehicle miles traveled. And that's really great because we actually don't appreciate that metric probably enough. Every mile is pretty expensive, as you'll see in the next slide. We like this number quite a bit, $2 on road wear and tear. Now, if that seems high, because what that implies, to be totally clear, is that every mile one person drives in a car costs about that much. Now, that is on the upper end of what the research says a mile saved by car costs. And how they arrived at that number was through a pretty detailed study of an actual document produced by AASHTO, which is the American Association of Highway Engineers. They came up with that number because they were looking at the amount of road infrastructure that would then not have to be built if you save those vehicle miles traveled. I feel justified in using this high number because this state has shown an extremely zealous appetite at rapid road expansion. We have spent the lion's share of money that the WashDOT has on I-5 expansion. We have had a lot of really expensive projects like the tunnel through downtown Seattle to replace the viaduct, like the Second Narrows Bridge, ongoing replacements about the interchange between 16 and Tacoma, as well as expensive highway projects all over the state, which we'll return to later on in a really impactful way. Coming down to it, moving from a rather high liberal number for road wear and tear down to an extremely conservative number, a very real way, that we see savings when we divert car trips to trains is that the rate of accident and deaths for train passengers drops to almost nothing. Trains are 18 times safer than cars, and this means that this means a terrific, appreciable savings from accidents that just don't happen, or from people that are no longer encountered in accidents. And this is the lowest number that we could find that tabulate for every mile that you drive a car, or not drive a car in this case, you save 12 cents for accidents and deaths that don't occur. There's also, of course, roughly half the CO2 emissions that we see, which is quantifiable in another way, which is highly, that could be a whole presentation in itself. So moving on. Interestingly, because Washington State is kind of at the forefront in some ways, we have seen the idea that we need to reduce vehicle miles traveled codified in law. We have goals, and it almost 20% drop this year, which we may see in part because of some of the impacts related to the ongoing pandemic. However, by 2035, we're supposed to see a 30% drop in overall vehicle miles traveled, and by 2050, we're supposed to see present day vehicle miles traveled, or at least present day in 2006, drop by half. That's a really impressive number. And as we're finding out more and more about the negative impacts of car travel, I mean, just today, actually, I learned that one of the major sources of pollutants and problems for salmon being able to return to their native streams from the Puget Sound, they actually found a particular preservative in car tires. They just figured this out, Seattle Public Utilities, that it's actually a powder that comes off of tires that is preventing a lot of the salmon runs from flourishing. It's this particular preservative. And this is just one of the many ways that cars impact our native landscape, as well as impact our daily lives. And so we can see why we want to hit these numbers, but at the same time, practically, a 50% reduction is a really extreme idea. And the only way we're going to be able to achieve this is if we provide really robust alternatives to car travel. And in this case, more service by trains covering the entire state is really in service of these goals. So what we did to try to figure out what the actual granular impacts of east-west service would do is we were able to borrow from this survey that was contained in the STEER analysis. This is really handy because STEER only presented a broad ridership number for their estimates. This gave us a very granular view of how the ridership would actually be dispersed throughout the corridor from Seattle all the way to Spokane via Auburn, Tri-Cities, Yakima, etc. And as you can see, Auburn would enjoy about a 12% portion of ridership, which is pretty high. It's actually the third highest that's listed here after Seattle. And it's it is so there'd be some real local benefits. With those numbers that we came up with earlier, dealing with saved vehicle miles traveled, we managed to kind of turn this into an impact. So this particular grid right here, you'll see that we talk about 23,000 riders hitting Auburn every year from the STEER report. And going on to the next slide, we see that converted into an overall savings. So trips to Auburn would save the state around $2 million in road costs that we would no longer have to encounter. So there's savings for Auburn in particular. Of course, for the entire route, this adds up pretty quickly to 33 million. And there it is, the number drawn out for you to see. So that's the STEER report on its surface. However, there's pretty big gaps, and one of the biggest gaps is the fundamental assumption that ridership would only be derived from cars. You see, riders on trains in Washington State, passengers on Amtrak, haven't behaved that way. And this isn't just on the Cascades corridor in Western Washington. This is inclusive of the Empire Builder, or right now the current only train that runs west over the Cascades to Spokane from Seattle. less than half of the passengers that we see on trains come from cars. Now, certainly it's the plurality, but it's only 47%. An additional third would fly, about 10% would take the bus, and amazingly, 11% of the trips wouldn't have happened at all. We're going to talk about those in a bit too. This implies that Steer perhaps underestimated the potential ridership of the corridor by as much as half if we look at the demographics that presently ride trains today in the state. And so breaking this out, no, you can go to the next slide, that's fine. One of the most valuable tranches that Steer did not contemplate were those 11% of riders that wouldn't travel at all. That's what we call induced travel, and it's extremely valuable. Overall, nationwide, about 8% of Amtrak travelers wouldn't travel. And here in Washington, it actually jumps up several points to over 10%. More people would not travel than would take a bus instead of train. We can turn these into some real numbers. Every trip in Washington state is pretty valuable. From Experience Washington, which is our recently reactivated tourism agency for the state, we know that about every day trip that occurs in the state is worth $84. That's $84 that people spend that they would not otherwise spend for having taken a day trip. Every overnight visitor spends $366, and that's regardless of where they stay in the state. That's downtown Spokane or downtown Seattle or anywhere in between. That is the average number. And so every time you have people traveling when they wouldn't have before, that's generating money for the communities where they go. So if we take a hypothetical tranche of the Steer projected ridership and say that those people wouldn't have traveled before, that adds up to a significant sum of raw spending that wouldn't have normally occurred in that community. In Auburn, that means about $1 million every year of tourist spending. Overall for the route, that's almost $8 million, 7.7. Another area of real savings and benefit to Washingtonians is the fact that right now you really only have two choices. There is some limited bus service over the Cascades, but the grand majority of people either drive or they fly. If you fly, you pay for it. Right now, airfare costs about 47 cents per passenger mile. Right now, fares on the Amtrak Cascades are roughly half that at 26 cents, and this adds up fast. Going to the next slide. Overall, for the entire projected ridership of the east-west trains, we'd see that Washingtonians would save over $8 million on airfare that they wouldn't have spent before. And this could easily turn into savings, or better yet, for the economic impact, more spending in the places that they go. Fundamentally, this isn't just about economic impact, it's about the kind of transportation policy and state we live in. The de facto policy is right now is if you can't afford to pay Horizon Air what can be really expensive flights, you better saddle up and put some chains on your tires because there isn't another way over the mountains. And they are closed, those passes, several times a year. The nice thing about trains is that they are amazingly weather resilient. They are perhaps the most weather resilient form of ground transportation and often will get through in conditions that will easily close roads and airports. This is a matter of resiliency and holistic policy. And maybe because of that, Steer did cite a really encouraging statistic. They had never seen a support rating for a prospective service as high as the one that they found here in Washington state. 76% of respondents reacted positively to the notion of more service over the Cascades between Eastern and Western Washington. Using the same high-level numbers that we did for maintenance and reduced fatalities, airfare spending, and visitor spending, we figured out that in 2019, the Cascades was worth about $88 million to the state. That's really big because that isn't just generally, that's every year. Going to the next slide, you'll see that the Cascades has regularly been spitting that out every year. And this is because the Cascades has routinely carried about 800,000 passengers. However, it's interesting that it has only carried that many people. 800,000 people seems to be about the ceiling of Cascades ridership thus far. That's between, inclusive from Vancouver, BC, all the way to Eugene. This is because the Cascades simply doesn't operate enough. At least it didn't up until 2019. If we look at ridership versus trains per day, you'll notice an exponential relationship. Every one of these triangles represents a different state-supported corridor passenger train service in the United States. One of the most telling things is that the steer ridership, if you'll look at the lower left-hand part of the map, steer ridership is right where every other twice daily service is. Well beneath 500,000 passengers because you're capping capacity and convenience at the number of trains. The regular Cascade service moves up the curve a bit to just under 1 million passengers a year. And if we were to say implement those extra 2 Cascades trains a day that we should have had in 2018, we would have moved further up the curve still. You'll note that in the original Cascades service plan published in 2006, we were to have about 13 trains a day, and they projected almost 3 million passengers. We can see from experience around the country that this is really backed up by the actual ridership that we see. This is especially important for ridership in Auburn. One of the biggest problems, I would say, regarding the city of Auburn and the STEER study is that they didn't really contemplate any increased ridership between Seattle and Auburn, and they didn't understand it. And the excuse for this in the report was that Auburn was, quote, already served by Sounder trains. Now, I took an issue with that statement because this would fundamentally change the dynamic of service in Auburn, because what it would do is introduce reverse frequencies. Right now, the majority of service that Auburn enjoys goes one direction. It is for peak commutes to Seattle and peak commutes back south. Having a train going to Spokane via Auburn would not only vastly increase the number of trip pairs, and so it would turn the station into a more dynamic place where you could get to the entire state, but it would also introduce more trains at different times of day, which fundamentally, as we can see from experience developed around the country, would garner an increase in ridership along an exponential curve. So I think that STEER really understated what the service could mean to Auburn. Additionally, back when Amtrak used to use the Stampede Corridor for east-west service, and we're going back a few decades now, it's interesting to note that there was throughway bus service originating from the South Sound region. That's Olympia-Tacoma area, had bus connections going to the station in Auburn. And so this would imply an opportunity for Auburn to become something of a regional transit hub. And with that comes great opportunities that we still haven't really looked into. This could turn into an intermodal center, which would then spear off great benefits for downtown Auburn and the businesses there. Going to the next slide. In 2006, we saw these Cascade service goals of about 3 million passengers and 13 daily trips. Just imagine if Auburn could also be a node in this system. Every year, if we were to grow the service to that size, we would see over $300 million benefit to the state, again, based on the admittedly simple methodology that we've seen here. But it's a big enough number to show that we should figure out more about what service means for the state and the fact that the state could see some real savings from it. Overall, this is a list of the sorts of improvements that we have made and need to make to allow more trains to operate in Washington state. And you can see some pretty big numbers in here. The advanced wayside signaling system is $500 million. Kelso to Martin's Bluff rail project was almost $500 million. The east-west projected improvements are a little less. They see that as a little less than $400 million in capital improvements that we need to make to run trains, or just a little less than what the Point Defiance bypass cost. And these numbers may seem kind of big, right? A little scary. But let's go to the next slide. What is really remarkable is for 2 miles of highway in just north of Tacoma, we see $220 million of spending. For 6 miles of highway passes over the Snoqualmie, over Snoqualmie Pass, we would see $280 million, or almost what the lowest contemplated capital cost of east-west passenger rail service would be. The difference being the fact that we're talking about 6 miles of highway versus a 400-mile rail corridor. Really, in the grand scheme of what WashDOT spends, we're just not talking about a lot of money here. And this is the sort of perspective that we need to be seeing more and more often. Anyway, that's it for me. I saw a couple of questions pop up. I can certainly attempt to answer those.
Go ahead.
Let's.
Here's the questions. Can you tell us, Patrick?
Oh, you know what? They were actually separate. They were separate messages. My mistake.
Oh, okay.
Certainly make space for any questions if there are any.
Well, Abe, it was interesting you commented about this tire chemical. I saw that article in the paper that you were talking about, and apparently my understanding is that it's tire dust contains this chemical, and this dust, of course, comes from wear and tear on the highways from the tires. And then when you get a significant rain, that dust is washed off the highway and into the little streams that go into the river. And apparently these fish, I think they were talking about coho salmon, die within a couple of days of being exposed to this stuff. So it's a big deal. I think some of our environmentally conscious legislators and groups such as the Sierra Club might be very interested in this.
Well, especially if we can show that, absolutely. And this sort of research is fascinating too, because for a long time they believed it was more of a cocktail of things that were causing the die-off. And now to reduce it to a single problem. But it also is a great evidence to show that, there's this idea that autonomous vehicles and electric cars are going to solve the majority of our problems, and that's just not true. The carbon emissions are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to polluting effects of automobiles. It's not, and it isn't, and I'm sure if we delved further into it, we could find problems with brake dust, all kinds of different issues that just aren't charted well enough. I mean, it's wonderful that they found these tire issues because at least we can begin to attack it. But in the meantime, it'd be wonderful if there was a far less impactful method. And there is, we just don't run it often enough, and that's our passenger trains.
Yeah, thanks for that, Abe. Any other questions for Abe?
There is something I did just want to mention very briefly. You make some great points about the extra frequencies that the East-West service would provide, Abe. And one of the things that you may have heard about this too, how Sound Transit is interested in implementing the Rail Plus program on the southern section of the Amtrak Cascades. Currently, just for reference, for those who aren't familiar with this, the Amtrak trains that normally would be running north of Seattle between Vancouver, BC and Seattle, WashDOT and Sound Transit have partnered together to allow for a few extra frequencies, whereby if you have a monthly pass for the Sounder North train, you can ride any of the Cascade trains between Seattle, Edmonds, and Everett, and you can pay the same fare riding the Sounder, but you can take the Cascades at a different time. Sound Transit has expressed interest in implementing this program south of Seattle as well. And I would imagine that by the time that we could get this up and running, not only would it be implemented on Amtrak Cascade south to Tacoma, but it could also be easily implemented with this train. So then it would really turn into a new commuting option for residents of South King County.
Yeah, I love that. I think it's a great way We need as much integration between transit agencies as possible. Oftentimes, they operate in vacuums, and we're lucky here to see the kind of coordination that might allow that, because what it would do effectively is allow us to make the most of the pretty big investments in capital that we're making to make the service happen. And the more we utilize the service that we pay for, the better deal the taxpayers are getting. The only danger is that if we do too good of a job and it becomes a victim of its own success, then some service restrictions may have to be put in place. Amtrak has this all the time on the Northeast Corridor with the various commuter agencies that run between Washington, D.C. and Boston, and the Amtrak intercity trains that overlay that very busy route. But unfortunately for us, we're quite a ways away from that level of service density. So in the meantime, I think it's great, especially because we only really historically saw the Cascades trains full on the weekends. And any way that we could take up some of that excess capacity and get people riding the trains during the week more regularly, I think it's fabulous. And I'm so glad that leadership is moving in that direction.
Thanks, Abe. Any other comments for Abe? Hearing none, we'll move on. I'd like to introduce Luis Muscoso. Luis is Government Affairs Director for All Aboard Washington, and he is a former co-vice chair of Washington State House of Representatives Transportation Committee, and also co-founder of the Legislative Rail Caucus. Luis is going to tell us a little bit about our 2021 legislative plans that All Aboard Washington has, including the East-West service. Luis.
Thank you, Gary, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be part of the fifth in our series, the Train Trek series here today. It's wonderful to see some new faces and interest in what we're doing with this series. I should also mention that given the historical aspect of our discussion so far today and some of the things that people may not be completely aware of, I started my work back in the mid-70s with community transit, and spent 25 years there and brought that experience to the legislature back in 2011. And one of the things that I was talking to some of our planners and engineers way back in, I think, 1978 or 79, as I was getting more interested in what our transportation problems around the state, I was saying, so where is our BART system like San Francisco had? Because I had heard about this system that was failed here in Washington State back in the late 60s, early 70s. And this engineer told me, we'll be lucky if you see that, by the time you retire. Well, flash forward to 2009, after 30 years in public service, I did retire as a PERS 1 employee the week after they turned on the very first the very first train from SeaTac to Seattle. And that was 2009. So I know that the problems in finding funding, as well as having the vision to really build, a regional as well as statewide transportation network is significantly difficult. But I think we're at the point now that more people are aware of what we really want the state to have in the future. And it is certainly time that the Amtrak Cascades and intercity passenger rail service, be prioritized and play a much larger role than it has been asked to do up to this time. So having retired from the legislature in 2016, I joined All Aboard. A year later, I was asked to do their public affairs when our executive director, Lloyd Flem, retired. And now 3 years on the job, working very closely with the legislature and my former colleagues, I can see that people are paying much more attention to how we should be looking at the Amtrak Cascades. It's unfortunate because of the derailment and then again the COVID and the economic downturn that we're probably now several years from realizing what might have been possible just a few years ago. But in that time going forward, we can really think about what we want to do here. We know revenue's down, and we know that we can't have the transportation budget we'd like to have and deserve. But we really have to ask ourselves, when that revenue does come back, what are our priorities and how can we address all of them, given the new information that we see coming forward in studies like what Steer did and what All Aboard's doing now, as well as in the fact that the public is also aware that, hey, I don't have to drive to town all the time. And how can I get between cities elsewhere in the state besides this? You know, back in the early 90s, when high-speed ground transportation was first committed to by the state, if you look at the bill from that time and the RCW 4779, you will see what was expected to have happened by 2020 and 2030. Some of those goals can still be achieved if we can prioritize the work in the Amtrak Cascades, because there is some confusion now when you say high speed between all the new excitement about the ultra high speed rail, which is another system that is certainly working elsewhere in the world. And it's too bad the United States didn't start this themselves, you know, decades ago. But we have to be sure that the original high-speed ground transportation was the Amtrak Cascades. And the ultra-high speed that's being proposed and hopefully can be built, you know, 15, 20 years from now, we support that also. But in the meantime, we've got to get the Cascades up to what it was supposed to have achieved by now. So looking at the slides here, we'll run through this rather quickly. All Aboard has really moved very quickly in the last few years as a rail advocate into being a much more activist organization, allying with other groups around the state and other public officials, mostly realized in our Train Trek series and seeing how officials from 5 cities and their communities in Eastern Washington and Auburn have very willingly wanted to work with us on this particular project, and that we need to continue addressing this with the legislature. We just keep rolling through these slides here. You know, my background in the legislature, of course, helps a lot, but as anybody who's worked with the legislature or who has been a legislature knows, it really is about personal contact and relationships between constituents and their legislators. They're not going to do this for me. They're not just going to do it for All Aboard. They're going to do it because the public realizes this is something that they want, and it's necessary, and it has a lot of value. So we have a much more energetic and well planned out advocacy work with these individuals and groups you see on the screen, how we are outreaching to them on a monthly basis, and seeing that people are paying a lot more attention to All Aboard now, and not just being a group of rail fans that enjoys trains and understands their necessity, that we are a consumer and taxpayer-based organization that is really speaking for the needs of the riding public by train. Our relationship with these professional and public groups, we have spoken to city and county governments as well as regional ones, and to remind them that much of their work on transportation for decades has had an element dealing with trains, particularly the Cascades, but they don't seem to pay much attention to it anymore. And now they're realizing that they can't build their way out of this. They've known that for a while, and it's time to reassert where does the Cascades fit into this program going forward. Okay, I think you can see that a lot of what I'm speaking to here are things that we've spoken to in our previous presentation from Abe and from Pete and others, that we kind of get this. If you're on this call today, you want to know more about how to do this, and are your impressions of what All Aboard's been saying, or things you may have been reading in the transportation blogs in Seattle and elsewhere, you know, are they aware of what's really happening here, and how can we make this happen? I mentioned that 30-year mandate going back to the original high-speed ground transportation bill and the subsequent RCW, which is a template for what we wanted to achieve, and I think we can still get there. Okay, so we are looking at our plan here to go forward. We know that after the Steer report that came out last summer, and what you heard about from Abe today about some of the gaps in that research that even they acknowledge need further investigation, that we've got to get the legislature to accept the fact that this is something that they should want to do. The funding, of course, is another matter, and it may not be enough there at the moment because of the revenue shortfalls, but getting them to acknowledge, now that they've seen this report, the first one since 2001, be 20 years ago, the last time they looked at this corridor, that it is more than enough time to realize we need to get working on this and doing some further studies as how that gets done. Looking at the capital and operating costs, assessing the economic impacts, and the cost benefit analysis, as you can read on that slide there. The county rail districts, we hope to resubmit a bill that we originally had put in a couple of years ago that would allow county rail districts to share and match taxes in order to help them work on rail development in their community. The Northwest Rail Commission is a relatively new idea that was given to us by some folks with Transportation for America and Rail Commission in Southern United States, wanting to expand on these commissions where you would have multi-state involvement and investment in how we can get this network up and going. There's more that I don't want to get into right here. It's quite an interesting topic. I do understand from a recent conversation with WashDOT that the next report on the ultra high speed rail study, which is due out next week or shortly thereafter, will possibly relate somewhat to this particular issue as the governance issue about how that ultra high speed would operate and the financing package necessary may be tied to the same thing that the Rail Commission is purportedly would do also. Whether that's specific to the Rail Commission federal legislation, I don't know. I haven't seen the report yet. And the people I talked to didn't have that detail either, but they did say that when that comes out, we should talk about how that ties into that particular study. And the last bill there, the Managing the Cascades, was something that I had submitted back in 2013 when I was in the legislature, along with a colleague in Oregon, to authorize how WashDOT and ODOT would be working more closely together with British Columbia. Now, we know they talk together, right? So this isn't telling them to do this so much as how they might be a little more connected and in agreement on how to do it. Some of the problems that we've seen coming out after the derailment, issues around equipment and funding and the Amtrak contract, have revealed that all three of these entities are not exactly on the same page just because they've negotiated separately. British Columbia, of course, doesn't really put any money into this system. We're providing service to Vancouver, now suspended, and that needs to be addressed further. That particular bill was easily passed in the Oregon legislature. Unfortunately, I couldn't even get the companion bill, identical bill, even into a hearing in the House Transportation Committee back in 2013. So I would like to at least bring this up again, that maybe looking at some of the difficulties they've had around the currently being negotiated Amtrak contract with ODOT and WashDOT, that there might be something in my original bill that could help them work on these things together. We're not privy to all the difficulties they might be having in these negotiations, but enough gets out in conversations with officials both in Washington as well as in the Northwest that there's more difficulties than there really should be in getting this contract settled. It's been going on now for many months, if not even longer, in the anticipation of needing new equipment and who would be paying for the service, given the fact that Amtrak, does not provide as much support as they did in the past, and are looking for the states to do even more in the future. So for those of you who have any experience with the legislature, and I'm guessing that most of you have, this should not be something foreign to you to see what's happening here. We are trying to ensure that our membership and our growing interest in our work is finely tuned to help us contact the legislature. As you probably have seen and should be aware that because of the pandemic, no one's been allowed on campus now for the better part of a year. And the legislature will likely not even be meeting in the legislative building other than its initial startup on January, because of the needs to have social distancing. What I've heard, and I don't know if they've agreed to this yet, is they're looking at meeting at the gymnasium there at St. Martin's University, so that they can be careful about transmitting any of the disease. But what does that mean for constituents and for advocates in meeting with legislators and talking to them? If everything is done virtual, it's difficult enough to see how the legislature is going to handle all the meetings. You maybe heard that the Democratic caucus has proposed limiting bills to a certain number in their own caucus, and the other caucuses have not agreed to that. But I would imagine that everyone's going to have to realize we cannot, handle the volume of bills, usually several thousand, that come in every year. We're going to have to really pare that down if all we have is virtual communication to get things done. So I think what this may actually be of some benefit by focusing on just fewer bills and recognizing that transportation is extremely important to our state for all the reasons already stated, as well as the fact that it can and certainly should be seen as part of the recovery, economic recovery from the pandemic, that if we can contact our legislators and other public officials in a very well-organized fashion through emails, which now becomes sort of the very best way to reach out to people, as well as handwritten letters, that this will have to be the main focus and thrust of all the board's lobbying efforts, because there'll be no need and no way to communicate, in person here in Olympia. Going back to that last slide, just one second. I think maybe we're going to say more about this, but it said participate in upcoming events. We used to have the last couple of years something we call whistle stops, which were evening get-togethers in Olympia with legislators and other transportation stakeholders in the ports. Clearly, that cannot happen in 2021. And I don't know that having a whistle stop type webinar like we're doing today is going to be all that attractive to legislators who are going to be so swamped that with their virtual calls going on all day for the number of committees that they're in, as well as their caucuses, and then trying to fit in, how are they going to ever talk to their constituents virtually? Nigh on to impossible. So that's why, emails are probably the best thing, because those things will be processed by their own staff. These train trek series, though, I know that we're talking about having those continue forward. And I think that's a way, once the session is over, that we continue with the effort we've started this fall to make sure that people know not just about the East-West corridor, which I think has gained enough impetus right now that we'll be able to keep that rolling. But we also have to have some events that will show some of the larger picture about the significance of the Cascades, even on the I-5 corridor, some of the issues that Abe brought up, and making sure that the environmental community and others realize that the Cascades is part of the answer that they're looking for. And all those folks who are understandably excited about ultra high speed rail and all that it will bring a couple of decades from now, much of that can be realized through the Cascades in far less time than that, just by using the service we have and will have as soon as the pandemic is over, not to mention any expansion of the Cascades long before the first high-speed corridor is even designated and land purchased. So with all of that, I want to thank you for attending our session today, and looking forward to maintaining contact with public officials and any other organizations and individuals on this call today, so that we can work together in the upcoming session as allies to make sure that your interest in transportation and our awareness of your concerns about your particular focus on that we can help you too. Thank you.
Be a question or two up there.
Oh,
There are, we've had a couple of good comments, one from Tim Gould regarding sound transit and from Barry Green. generally about the events in detail. So we thank both of you for that. We'll definitely be getting back to both of you about that. We do have, as Luis just said, in the next couple of weeks, you'll be hearing from us. In the next week or so, you'll be hearing, hopefully there'll be two items that you'll be getting. One is an outline of the what we envision our legislative goals will be for 2021 and 2022. And so we'll have more details about that coming out in the next few days. We also will be sending out a request for funding. Those of you who know, I'm sure everyone knows that it's been a difficult year in 2020. We're looking for as much funding as we can to keep All Aboard Washington moving. So you'll be hearing from us about that. And we hope that you will participate in both of those items. Then in early 2021, as Luis said, we do anticipate continuing the train track series. We don't have dates and times for those yet, but we will certainly let you know. Anyone who is not already on our mailing list or our email list, please do so. That way we'll make sure that you get the information when you need it. Again, thank you very much for participating. And if we don't talk to you, have a wonderful holiday season. Keep safe, keep well, and let's look forward to a better 2021.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.